When I collapsed during my wedding, my in-laws left the venue. My new mother-in-law even posted, "Ruined by dramatics." Days later, still in cardiac care, I got 62 missed calls and a message from my husband. "The caterer wants payment. Sort it." The ceiling of the Hargrove Estate ballroom was hand-painted with gold leaf cherubs, and I know this because it was the last thing I saw before my legs stopped working. Not a gradual fade, not the cinematic slow motion of a woman gracefully losing consciousness in a manner designed for sympathy. Just one moment I was standing at the head table in my wedding dress, reaching for my champagne flute to begin the toast I had spent 6 weeks writing and rewriting and rehearsing in my bathroom mirror at 6 a.m. So in the next moment the cherubs were directly above me, and someone was screaming, and the sound of 200 guests pivoting in their chairs was a noise I would later describe to a cardiologist as something like the ocean, which he would note in my file without comment. I was 29 years old. It was the happiest day of my life, and my heart had decided without consultation that the timing was interesting. What I did not know, lying on the marble floor of a venue that had cost my parents $24,000 to rent for a single evening, with my dress pulled around me and one shoe missing because it had come off when I fell, was that my new husband Gareth was already looking at his phone. I know this because 3 different guests later told me independently, without knowing the others had mentioned it, that Gareth was scrolling before the paramedics arrived. I want to be precise about that timeline. I had been his wife for approximately 90 minutes when he chose his phone over my body on the floor of the ballroom we had reserved 14 months in advance. I had been with Gareth Nolan for 4 years when we got engaged, and I had spent those 4 years doing what I now understand was a sustained act of translation, taking the evidence in front of me and converting it laboriously and with genuine effort into something more palatable than what it actually was. Gareth was 33, a commercial real estate broker in Portland, Oregon, tall and quick-talking and genuinely charming, in the way of a person who has learned early in life that charm is more efficient than effort and has never seen sufficient reason to challenge that conclusion. He was not cruel, he was not loud, he was not the kind of person whose behavior produced obvious external alarm. He was something more difficult to name and therefore more difficult to leave, a person who was consistently present in all the ways that could be photographed and consistently absent in all the ways that couldn't. He forgot things that mattered and remembered things that were convenient. He was excellent at occasions, birthdays, holidays, the grand gestures that circulated on social media and produced admiring comments, and poor at ordinary days. The maintenance of a life shared between 2 people, the small continuous acts of attention that constitute actually caring about someone rather than performing the caring of them. His family was worse if measured differently. His mother, Paulette Nolan, was a 61-year-old retired school administrator who had the social performance of a woman deeply invested in how her family appeared to the world and the private behavior of someone who had genuinely never considered that other people's interior lives were as real and as fragile as her own. She had opinions about my career. I was a landscape architect, which she considered creative in the slightly dismissive way that certain people use that word, as a synonym for not serious. About my family's financial bracket relative to theirs, about my body, my laugh, the wine I ordered at restaurants, the way I said hello on phone calls. She delivered these opinions wrapped carefully in the syntax of concern, which is a technique I have come to recognize as one of the more sophisticated forms of unkindness available to people who want to wound without accountability. She was very good at it. She had had decades of practice. I had told myself for 4 years that she would soften, that the wedding would be a turning point, that becoming officially family would change the temperature of things. I was wrong about essentially all of it, and I had known I was wrong in the part of myself I had been declining to consult. The cardiac event, which is the clinical term for what happened on the floor of the Hargrove Estate ballroom, and which I prefer to other available phrases because it is accurate and because accuracy had become, in the months that followed, a value I held with a new and specific intensity, was caused by a previously undiagnosed arrhythmia. My heart had a structural irregularity in its electrical conduction system, a congenital variation present since birth, that had never produced symptoms significant enough for me to seek evaluation, and which had been sitting quietly in my chest for 29 years, like an unexploded piece of ordnance waiting for the correct combination of stress, dehydration, and adrenaline to detonate. The correct combination apparently was a wedding. My own. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes, which the lead technician, a young man named Abel Torres, who had the specific cardioverted me in the venue itself, a procedure that I did not feel because I was not conscious for it, but which I was told involved a device pressed to my chest and a shock delivered to interrupt the runaway electrical pattern my heart had adopted. They transported me to OHSU Hospital, where I was admitted to the cardiac care unit and placed under continuous monitoring. My parents were in the ambulance with me, my mother holding my hand and my father sitting with his elbows on his knees in the way he sits when he is frightened and does not want to show it. My matron of honor, a woman named Priya Subramaniam, who had been my closest friend for 11 years, and who had, it emerged through multiple accounts, stayed on the floor beside me the entire duration of the paramedics' work, rather than stepping back to give them space. She had stayed close, she told me later, because she didn't want me to be unconscious without someone who loved me within arm's reach, was in a car behind the ambulance driven by her husband Suresh, who had not been able to park close enough and had run 2 blocks to the venue entrance when he heard the sirens. Gareth arrived at the hospital 47 minutes after I did, which I know because the admitting nurse noted the time of each visitor's arrival in my chart, and I later requested that chart in its entirety, as was my right, and read every time-stamped entry with the focused attention of someone conducting a site survey. He did not stay the night. He told my mother he had to contact the vendors to let them know what had happened. He said this to my mother rather than to me because I was not conscious enough at that point to receive information. See, when I have since spent time wondering what he would have said if I had been. He left at 11:15 p.m. My parents did not leave until 2:30 in the morning, when a nurse gently suggested that rest would serve everyone better, and they drove home and came back at 7 a.m. The post appeared on Paulette Nolan's public Facebook page while I was being monitored in the cardiac care unit on the first night. It was a photograph taken inside the venue before the guests had fully dispersed, showing the Hargrove Ballroom with its gold leaf cherubs and its towering floral arrangements and its untouched 6-tier wedding cake that had cost $3,800 and had been eaten by exactly no one because the reception had ended before the cake was cut. The caption read, "What a shame." A beautiful evening derailed by dramatics. Prayers for everyone who traveled so far. She had tagged the venue, the florist, and the caterer in the post. She had not tagged me. She had not tagged Gareth. Derailed by dramatics was doing, and derailed by dramatics was doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence. And the work it was doing was constructing a public narrative in which her new daughter-in-law had staged or exaggerated a health crisis in order to, presumably, disrupt the evening for the assembled guests and ruin a beautiful occasion through some motive that the post did not specify, but implied was rooted in personal instability. 14 of her Facebook friends had commented with variations of "too bad," and "what a disappointment, and your family deserved better," and "I'm sorry it went this way," before my sister found the post at 1 a.m. and called Priya, who called my mother, who came to my bedside at 1:20 a.m. and sat in the chair beside me and showed me the post on her phone and told me what it said in the careful, measured way of a woman who has decided that her daughter needs to know this, but is weighing every word for the correct dose. I read it in the cardiac care unit with electrode stickers on my chest and an IV in my left arm and a monitor above my bed displaying my heart's electrical activity in the green and white lines that had become the landscape of my days. I read it twice. I did not feel what I expected to feel, which was the hot, destabilizing surge of anger or grief that I associated with significant betrayals. What I felt instead was something very cold and very clear and very still, the specific quality of understanding that arrives when you stop performing confusion and simply look at what is in front of you. The beginning of something. Not anger. Something more useful than anger. The beginning of accuracy. The text from Gareth arrived on day 4 of my hospitalization, at 6:14 p.m., as I was watching the light change through the window of the step-down monitoring unit to which I had been transferred that morning. An improvement by clinical measure, a room with slightly more natural light and slightly less alarming equipment, though still equipped with the overhead monitor that displayed my cardiac rhythm and produced an alert when the pattern deviated, which it had done twice in the preceding 4 days in ways that had produced in me a quality of focused and unpleasant self-awareness that is difficult to describe to people who have not experienced it. The sensation of watching a machine tell you, in real time, that your own body is doing something outside your control or consent. Dr. Felicia Omondi, my cardiologist, 44 years old, trained at Johns Hopkins, and then at OHSU's Cardiac Electrophysiology Fellowship, with a quality of directness that I recognized as a form of respect for her patients rather than a lack of warmth, had sat beside my bed that morning and explained the findings from the electrophysiology study conducted 2 days prior. I had a condition called Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome, she said, a congenital accessory electrical pathway in the heart that under specific conditions, high heart rate, significant adrenaline, certain triggers, could initiate a rapid and potentially dangerous arrhythmia. The treatment was a procedure called catheter ablation, in which a catheter was threaded to the precise location of the accessory pathway and the tissue was eliminated using radiofrequency energy. Success rate above 90%, recovery typically straightforward. She recommended scheduling within the next 2 weeks while I was already in the hospital system and being monitored. I'd asked her to explain it again, not because I hadn't understood the first time, but because I needed to hear it more than once to feel the weight of it settle properly. She explained it again without any suggestion that my need for repetition was unusual. She said I had been lucky in the specifics of that evening, the speed of the paramedic response, the availability of defibrillation equipment at the venue, the absence of any complicating factors in the cardioversion. She said it looking at my chart rather than at me, which was the tactful way of not noting aloud that other factors surrounding the evening had been considerably less favorable. I appreciated the tact. The text from Gareth arrived 40 minutes after she left the room. I was still sitting with the conversation, still arranging the medical information into the part of my mind where facts live, when my phone lit up on the bedside table. His message read, "Hey, caterer is asking about the final balance. Think it was your card on file? Can you sort it when you get a chance? The outstanding catering balance for the Hargrove Estate reception of Mara Selby and Gareth Nolan, contracted and managed over 8 months and paid for primarily from my personal savings, with a contribution from my parents and a smaller contribution from Gareth, was $4,400. My card was on file because I had managed every logistical element of the wedding. All vendor contracts, all payment schedules, all correspondence, all coordination between 12 separate vendors over 14 months of planning that I had done primarily alone because Gareth was busy and because I had been telling myself for 14 months that his absence from the planning was a quirk of his schedule rather than a statement about how he valued the thing being planned. The problem was not the logistical accuracy of the request. The problem was sorted. The problem was, when you get a chance. The problem was that those 2 phrases delivered to a woman in a cardiac step-down monitoring unit who had not yet been cleared for discharge and whose discharge timeline depended on the outcome of a scheduled ablation procedure were the entirety of the message. Not "how are you today?" Not "how did the conversation with the cardiologist go?" Not "I'm sorry I haven't been here more?" Not "I love you, I'm scared, I'm sorry about everything." The caterer wants payment? Sort it. When I put the phone face down on the bedside table and looked at the monitor above my bed for a long time, watching my own heart conduct its business. It was doing what it was supposed to do, steady, measured, honest. More reliable in that moment than anything else in the room. and I found something in that observation that was either darkly funny or simply true, and I couldn't determine which. Priya arrived at 7 that evening with takeout from the Thai restaurant nearest the hospital. Because she had on day 2 correctly identified that hospital food was a secondary injury being compounded on top of a primary one, and had appointed herself the unofficial catering operation for my recovery. She brought pad see ew and spring rolls and 2 portions of the mango sticky rice she knew I had a weakness for. And she sat in the visitor's chair, and we arranged the containers between us and ate without speaking for a few minutes in the way that is only possible with people who have been friends long enough that silence is not a problem requiring solution. Then I handed her my phone with the screen showing Gareth's message. She read it. She set the phone on the table. She ate a bite of her noodles. Then she said, "Aim, in the careful way of someone who has been waiting for the right moment and has decided this is it. I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it as coming from someone who has loved you for 11 years, and who also has not spent those 11 years performing selective blindness about the person you've been with for 4 of them." I told her to say it. She said, "He was on his phone when you were on the floor. I was next to you. I saw it. His mother called it dramatics on Facebook while you were in an ambulance. He has been to this hospital twice in 4 days, for a combined total of maybe 5 or 6 hours, while your parents have been here essentially every waking hour since you were admitted. And that text is not an aberration or a lapse or a miscommunication. That text is a clear and unambiguous statement of what you are in the hierarchy of his concerns. And it is the same statement he has been making in various forms for the 4 years I have been watching, and the only difference now is that you don't have the energy left to translate it into something else." She said all of this without raising her voice, without gesturing, without the kind of heat that would have given me something to push back against. She said it as a statement of observed fact, the way you report a measurement. I looked at the phone. I looked at the monitor. I looked at the spring roll in my hand and put it back in the container because I had lost the appetite for it. "You're right," I said. That was all. She nodded and handed me the mango sticky rice because she understood that this particular moment required dessert rather than dinner, and we ate without saying anything else for a while, and when she left at 9:30 I got out my phone and opened the notes application and began making a list. Which is what I do when the emotional system exceeds its capacity and the planning system takes over as the only available backup. The list had 3 sections. Medical: complete the ablation procedure, follow Dr. Omondi's post-procedure protocols in full, establish an ongoing cardiology relationship with her practice for annual monitoring. Financial: identify all accounts, both joint and separate, pull the last 12 months of statements on everything I had access to, do not make any financial moves until I had spoken to a professional. Legal: consult a family law attorney before saying anything to Gareth that could be characterized as either acceptance or rejection of the marriage, and do not respond to any financial requests from him or his family until that consultation had occurred. I added a 4th section, documentation: screenshot everything, archive every text message, keep a log of every visit and every contact attempt with timestamps. Oh, I was a landscape architect. I spent my professional life creating accurate records of existing conditions before beginning any design intervention, because a design built on inaccurate site data produces problems that cannot be solved by good intentions. The same principle applied here. I needed an accurate record of the existing conditions before I decided what to build from them, and I needed that record to exist somewhere outside my own memory, which I had demonstrated was susceptible to the kind of optimistic revision that 4 years of translating behavior had trained it toward. I showed Priya the list the next morning. She read it and looked at me with the expression she reserved for moments when she was about to say something she expected me to resist, and then she said, "He called twice yesterday while you were resting. Both times I answered because I had your phone. Both times the calls were about vendor payments, once the florist's overtime fee, once the parking situation at the venue. He did not ask how you were, either time." I looked at the documentation section of the list. I added, "log all calls through third parties." Then I asked her if she would consider staying involved in managing communications for the time being, given that I needed to limit my stress exposure per Dr. Amondi's instructions. Priya said she had already discussed this with Suresh, and they were in full agreement that she was handling this for as long as it needed handling. She said it in the tone of someone who made the decision 3 days ago and had simply been waiting for me to ask. My mother's name is Celestine Selby, and she had spent 22 years as a family law paralegal before transitioning to office management at a different firm, which meant that when I told her on day 6 that I was considering consulting an attorney, she did not produce the expression of shock or grief or reluctance that I had been preparing myself to navigate. She simply said, "Do you want me to call Renata?" Renata Ose-Kufur was a family law attorney in Portland who had been my mother's professional colleague for 7 years and whom I had met 3 times at my parents' annual Christmas gathering without once imagining I would need her in a professional capacity. She was 49 years old, Ghanaian American with 17 years practicing family law and a reputation that my mother described, with the precision of someone who has watched many attorneys work over 2 decades, as someone who does not lose things that shouldn't be lost. She came to the hospital on day 7, which I recognized as a significant act of professional accommodation. She was not billing for the travel. She was simply coming because my mother had called and the situation was what it was. And she waved off my acknowledgement of it when I tried to express appreciation, saying that hospital meetings were not uncommon in her practice and that certain conversations had a quality that required the setting you were actually in rather than the one that was convenient. She set a legal pad on my bedside table and sat in the visitor's chair with the settled quality of someone who had done this many times and had learned that the most efficient thing was to simply let the person tell it from the beginning in whatever order it arrived. "Tell me everything," she said. "From wherever you want to start." I started from the beginning. The 4 years, the translation habit, the wedding planning I had done largely alone, The text about the caterer, the Facebook post, the arrival time logged in my hospital chart. I told her about Paulette's history of concern-shaped cruelty delivered at social gatherings and holiday dinners, the way it had been invisible to most observers because it was always wrapped in solicitude, always accompanied by the performance of warmth. I told her about the calls Priya had logged. I told her about the moment I had read the caterer text and felt the translation stop, the sense of something in me simply declining to continue the work of converting what I was seeing into something I could live with. Renata wrote steadily throughout, asking occasional questions with a precision that made me understand she had a clear mental map of what information she needed and was navigating toward it efficiently. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me directly. "You've been married 8 days," she said. "You had a significant cardiac event on the day of the wedding. You are still hospitalized awaiting an ablation procedure. Your husband's primary observable concern during this period has been vendor payments. I want to ask you something directly and I'd like a direct answer. Are you considering annulment or divorce?" I told her I had not decided, but that I needed to understand what my options were and what the financial landscape looked like before I made any decision, and that I wanted to make a decision from accurate information rather than from either hope or grief. She nodded once, and I had the sense that this was the correct answer, not because it was what she wanted to hear, but because it was the answer of someone who was thinking rather than reacting. "In Oregon," she said, "annulment is available on narrow grounds: fraud, incapacity, prohibited degrees of relationship. What you're describing is more likely a divorce situation. The marriage is 8 days old, there are no children, and from what you've described, the financial entanglement is limited because you've maintained largely separate accounts. This is, from a legal and procedural standpoint, a relatively clean situation. What I need you to do before our next conversation is produce whatever financial documentation you have access to, and I need you to make no financial decisions or communications with Gareth until we have spoken again." I told her I had already been following that protocol. She looked at the list on my phone that I had shown her at the start of our meeting and said, "Good, keep doing that." The ablation procedure was scheduled for day 9. I spent days 7 and 8 in a particular kind of suspended state that I can only describe as the interior experience of waiting for your body to be worked on. The combination of clinical factual knowledge about what was going to happen and the inability of that knowledge to fully resolve the underlying experience of anticipation, of lying in a hospital bed watching your own heartbeat on a monitor and knowing that in some number of hours a catheter was going to travel to the precise location inside you where the wrong thing was happening and eliminate it. Dr. Amondi visited both days, answering questions I had accumulated since the previous visit, displaying the patient specificity that characterized all of her interactions with me. On day 8, she sat down for longer than her usual briefing, and I asked her something I had been holding, whether the arrhythmia could have been identified earlier, whether there were signs that should have been caught at some prior point in my medical history. She considered this carefully before answering, which told me the answer was not simple. She said that WPW syndrome frequently goes undetected until a triggering event occurs, that many people live their entire lives with the accessory pathway without experiencing a significant episode, that certain triggering conditions, she mentioned sustained high-stress states, extreme physical exertion, specific emotional contexts, could bring on an episode in someone who had never had one before. She said it without editorializing, without the kind of implication that I thought I detected in everything in those days, but the phrase specific emotional context stayed with me through the rest of that day and into the night before the procedure, where I lay in the monitored dark and thought about what the previous 4 years had cost my body in ways I had not been tracking because I was too busy managing other things. The procedure was completed on the morning of day 9 without complication. I was in recovery by noon, aware but not fully present, with the post-anesthesia fog of a mind returning to itself slowly and without particular urgency. Dr. Amondi came to the recovery room at 2:15 p.m. and stood at the foot of the bed with the expression she wore when she was delivering information she considered straightforward and positive. The accessory pathway had been successfully ablated. The post-procedure rhythm was normal. The 24-hour monitoring would begin immediately, and if the rhythm remained stable through the following morning, I would be eligible for discharge. She said the procedure had gone exactly as planned. She said the word exactly with the quiet satisfaction of someone for whom exactness was both a professional standard and a personal value. She said, "You should feel significantly better than you have been feeling, probably within 2 weeks of full recovery. The heart is a remarkably adaptable organ." I thought about that in the recovery haze. Remarkably adaptable. And I thought about all the adaptations I had been making, the rerouting and compensating and adjusting I had been doing for years to manage around what wasn't there, and I thought about how the heart does that work without being asked, without the psychological labor of deciding to do it, simply because maintaining function is what it is built for, and how the difference between what my heart did automatically and what I had been doing deliberately was the difference between an organism responding to its environment and a person choosing to remain in conditions that required the continuous expenditure of energy that could have been spent on other things. I was discharged on day 10. My heart was doing what it was supposed to do. Mine, functioning, honest, and finally not having to work around an obstacle that had been there since before I knew it existed. I did not go home. Priya had anticipated this, had been anticipating it, I suspected, since day 2, when she had arrived with the packed bag and the charger and the practical certainty of someone who has already run the calculation and arrived at the obvious answer. Her guest room had been prepared by Suresh with a humidifier and a reading lamp positioned correctly for someone who reads in bed, and a stack of books he had selected with the careful guesswork of a kind man who was trying to do something useful and didn't know exactly what I would want. I sat on the edge of the guest bed on the afternoon of my discharge and looked at the books and felt something shift in my chest that was not cardiac in origin, was simply the specific weight of being in a room where someone who barely knew me had thought about what I needed. I texted Gareth from the guest room. I'm staying with Priya to recover. Doctor says minimum 2 weeks before I can resume normal activity. We need to talk when I have more capacity. He replied in 4 minutes. Okay, sounds good. Also, did you end up calling the caterer? They emailed again. I put the phone in the nightstand drawer and did not take it out again until the following morning. When I called my bank and then called Renata. What the financial review produced was not surprise, but clarity. The kind that comes from documentation replacing memory, from numbers on a page replacing the imprecise impressions of years. Gareth and I had maintained largely separate finances throughout the relationship, which Renata confirmed was favorable to my legal position. There were 3 areas of genuine shared financial exposure. The first, a joint savings account opened approximately a year prior, at Gareth's suggestion, for what he had described as shared future planning, which currently contained $18,000. Second, the apartment lease, which was in my name with Gareth listed as an occupant, because he had been between credit situations when we moved in, and I had been the one with the cleaner financial history. Third, the outstanding wedding vendor invoices, 5 of which, the caterer at $4,400, the florist's overtime adjustment at $800, the photographer's final balance at $2,100, the venue's secondary damage assessment at $600, and the string quartet's balance at $1,500, totaled $9,400, and were in my name on the contracts, because I had signed all the contracts, because I had managed all the vendor relationships, because I had planned effectively the entire wedding. I had paid approximately $34,000 toward the wedding from my personal savings, accumulated over several years of careful spending and the kind of financial discipline that I had always quietly practiced. Gareth had contributed $12,000. His parents had contributed nothing, though they had attended with a party of 11, including 2 adult siblings and their spouses and a great-aunt from Cincinnati, whose travel Paulette had apparently assumed would be covered by the general hospitality of the occasion, and had ordered the premium open bar package that had added $2,200 to the venue's food and beverage minimum. Renata reviewed the complete documentation I had compiled, vendor contracts, payment records from my bank account, email chains, the photograph of the original catering estimate with my signature and Gareth's notably absent one, and said, "You have a clear and well-documented record of disproportionate financial contribution to a marriage of 8 days. In Oregon's equitable distribution framework, this is directly relevant to asset settlement and to any claims he might attempt to make against shared resources." She paused and turned a page. "I also want to formally document the Facebook post. It may become relevant if there are any defamation questions down the line, and at minimum it establishes a documented timeline of the family's response to your medical event." I had already taken the screenshots. I had taken it from the cardiac care unit on the first night, which was either professional instinct from the documentation habit I had been building for years, or a sign that some part of me, beneath all the translation, had always known that the accurate record needed to exist. Renata filed the divorce petition on day 19 of my marriage to Gareth Nolan. I was in Priya's guest room when the call came confirming it had been submitted to the Multnomah County Circuit Court, and I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment after hanging up and felt not the grief I had been expecting. The grief of ending something of the 4 years and the planning and the dress I had loved, and the morning of the wedding when everything had briefly felt like it was exactly what it was supposed to be, but something quieter and more fundamental, the specific relief of a decision made from information, or the feeling of a translation finally completed into the original language rather than the one that was easier to live with. Gareth received the filing through his attorney, a man named Oliver Garth who had handled his family's legal work for many years, and who was, it quickly became apparent, considerably more comfortable with commercial real estate transactions than with family law proceedings. His initial response, transmitted through Oliver to Renata, it was a request to handle everything quietly and without public proceedings. His second response, arriving 2 days later, was a revised claim that his $12,000 contribution to the wedding constituted a personal loan rather than a contribution, and that I owed him repayment. Renata read this proposal in my presence and described it, with the measured precision of her practice, as an argument that will not survive contact with the documentation you have provided. But I note the attempt with interest. What Gareth seemed not to understand, and what Oliver Garth may not have fully explained to him, was that I had the receipts, and literally. All of them, time-stamped, organized, filed in a folder on my laptop labeled Wedding Finances. Final, which had been created on the same evening I had assembled the seating chart and the vendor contact list and the day of timeline, because I had always known that someone needed to keep track of all of this. And I had known from early in the planning that that person was going to be me. Paulette's response to the divorce filing was louder. She had learned about it through Gareth, and her response was a second Facebook post, longer and more elaborately wounded than the first, about a young woman who had accepted a family's hospitality and goodwill for 4 years, and had revealed her character at the moment of greatest vulnerability. The post tagged mutual contacts, people from the Portland social and professional circles that Gareth and I had occupied together, colleagues of mine in the landscape architecture community, acquaintances from a volunteer board I sat on, people who had attended the wedding and had their own direct observations of the evening. It was live for 11 hours before a letter from Renata's office, citing Oregon's defamation statutes, requesting immediate removal and preservation of all copies for potential litigation purposes, arrived in Paulette's email and caused the post to come down. 11 hours was long enough. Screenshots existed. They were taken by perhaps 30 or 40 people before the deletion, including several of the mutual contacts who had been tagged, some of whom sent the screenshots directly to Priya, with messages ranging from concerned to furious. The professional contacts worried me most in the short term, because reputation in a services field is a long-term asset that takes years to build and can be damaged quickly, and I spent 2 days in Priya's guest room reading the screenshots and calculating the potential exposure before Priya sat me down and said, with the directness that had always been one of her best qualities, "You had a cardiac arrest at your own wedding? You have been in the hospital for 10 days. You filed for divorce because your husband's primary communication during your hospitalization was about vendor invoices. Anyone in your professional community who reads that post and decides it reflects worse on you than it does on the person who wrote it is not someone whose opinion of you was an asset worth keeping." This was logical. It did not make the vulnerability feel smaller, but it made the response to the vulnerability clearer, which was what I needed. My therapist, Dr. Yumiko Sato, 60 years old, in practice for 23 years, specializing in relational trauma and recovery, came to me through a recommendation from Dr. Omondi, who I later learned kept a short, carefully curated list of therapists for patients whose cardiac events occurred in the context of significant or sustained life stress. I found this detail moving in a way I had difficulty articulating, and I mentioned it to Dr. Sato in our first session, and she said, why, with the simple warmth that characterized her, "She's a thoughtful doctor." We met twice a week for the first 6 weeks and once a week after that, and the work we did was not primarily about the wedding or the divorce or the mother-in-law's Facebook posts, though we discussed all of those things with appropriate care and appropriate time. The work we did, at its center, it was about the translation habit itself, the mechanism by which I had spent 4 years converting evidence into something more comfortable, the cost of that mechanism, and what it would take to dismantle it and replace it with something more honest. Dr. Sato had the quality I was learning to identify in the best practitioners I'd encountered across all those weeks of medical and legal care. She made you do the thinking yourself and simply held the conditions in which the thinking could happen without the usual social pressure to arrive at conclusions that were easier or kinder or less disruptive than the true ones. "You describe him as not cruel," she said in our third session. "Tell me what cruel would have had to look like for you to have recognized it." That question occupied me for 3 weeks. The answer was not a comfortable one and contained information about myself that I was not entirely prepared for, specifically about the standards I had been applying to my own treatment versus the standards I would have applied without hesitation if a friend had described the same treatment to me. I thought about Priya, who had been describing it to me for years in the careful way of someone who loves you and does not want to force a conclusion you haven't reached. I thought about what it cost her to watch me translate. I owed her an apology I had not yet found the right words for, and when I tried to offer it one evening on her couch, she stopped me and said, "You don't owe me an apology, you owe yourself one." She said it without sentiment, the way she said true things, and I held it. The settlement conference was held 8 weeks after the filing, in a conference room at Renata's firm on the west side of Portland, with Oliver, Garth, and Gareth on one side of the table, and Renata and me on the other, and the process had the quality of all formal proceedings, slower and more careful and less dramatic than the situation that had produced them. Oliver Garth had prepared a position document that Renata had reviewed in advance and described to me as notable primarily for what it omitted, specifically any acknowledgement of the documented financial contribution disparity. Gareth sat through most of the conference with the particular focused stillness of someone who has been instructed by his attorney to limit his verbal participation, which he managed moderately well except for one moment, approximately 90 minutes in, when Renata was presenting the breakdown of wedding expenditures, and he said in a voice with an edge I had heard before but was now able to identify correctly, "She wanted the big wedding. I told her we could do something smaller." Renata paused for exactly 2 seconds, a pause I suspect was professional rather than spontaneous, yet the pause of someone who has made a deliberate choice about how to respond to an unhelpful comment, and then continued with the documentation without acknowledging what he had said, which was a more effective response than any alternative, because it treated his comment as what it was, irrelevant to the numbers on the page. Oliver Garth put a hand briefly on Gareth's arm. The settlement that resulted from that conference and the subsequent exchange of revised proposals over 3 weeks was, in Renata's assessment, equitable in the precise legal sense of that word, proportional to the documented financial reality rather than to the emotional architecture of the preceding 4 years. The vendor invoices were split along the ratio of each party's demonstrated financial contribution to the wedding, producing a reimbursement obligation from Gareth of $7,300 for the excess of his share. The joint savings account was divided equally at $9,000 each. He vacated the apartment without contest. The total settlement left me financially whole enough, not as whole as I would have been without the 4 years and the $34,000 and the 14 months of planning I had done alone for an event that had lasted 90 minutes before my heart made its opinion known, but whole enough to stand on accurately measured ground. The post that ended it, not legally, which was already concluded, but in the social geography of the shared community, came from Abel Torres, the paramedic. He had seen Paulette's original Facebook post through a mutual contact, and he had left a comment on it during the 11 hours it was live that was 6 sentences long, factual in tone, and devastating in its precision in the way that only direct observation by a professional witness can be. He described arriving at the Hargrove Estate venue. He described the scene he encountered and the medical intervention he performed. He described, in the careful clinical language of his training, the observable behavior of the patient's family members during and after the intervention. He used the phrase "bystanders exited the venue" prior to patient stabilization, which was accurate and professional and read, in its social context, as the most consequential thing anyone could have written about the evening. He was not identified in the comment as a first responder, simply as someone who had been present and had specific direct knowledge of what had occurred. The comment received 231 responses before Paulette deleted the original post, and by that point it had been captured and circulated widely enough that the deletion changed into nothing. The digital record existed. The accurate version of the evening existed. I heard about this from Priya on a Wednesday morning, who called me at 8:20 a.m. with the specific energy of someone who has been watching a long-running situation arrive at its correct resolution and cannot fully contain the satisfaction of it. She read me the comment. She read me several of the responses. I sat at my desk in my office. I had returned to work 6 weeks after discharge, cleared by Dr. Amandi for full activity, my heart doing what it was supposed to do with the steady reliability of a mechanism that had been correctly repaired. And I listened and looked out the window at the courtyard garden I had designed 2 years prior, the one with the Japanese maples that went orange in October, and the decomposed granite paths, and the small recirculating water feature that produced the sound of moving water without the excess of it. And I thought about Abel Torres making a decision to write 6 sentences in a public space about something he had witnessed, not for any personal gain, not because anyone asked him to, but simply because he had been there and he knew what accurate looked like, and he had decided that accurate was worth saying. I thought about what it means to be a person who says the accurate thing even when it is inconvenient. I thought about how long I had been practicing the opposite of that, and what it had cost, and what I was practicing instead now. The divorce was finalized 3 months and 17 days after the filing. Renata called me on a Friday afternoon to confirm it, and I was in the middle of a site visit for a residential project in the West Hills, standing in the middle of a sloped backyard with a grade stake in my hand and mud on my boots. And I said thank you, and ended the call, and stood there for a moment in the October light looking at the slope I was going to work with. Not against, not around, but with, using the grade the way you use any honest condition, as the foundation of something true. Later that same afternoon I drove past the Hargrove estate on my way back to the office, not deliberately, simply because it was on the route, and I slowed enough to look at the exterior, the grounds, the arrival sequence, the plantings that had always been slightly wrong for the building, too formal for the natural setting, the kind of design choice that happens when someone imposes a preference rather than reading the site. I had recently been contacted about a redesign project for the property's exterior landscape, referred through a colleague, and I had said yes because the work was good work, and because I had decided that the accurate response to a place where something difficult had happened was not avoidance but presence. The cherubs were still on the ceiling inside, presumably. My heart was doing something different now than it had been doing then. I drove on. 6 months after the finalization, I met with B. Lindqvist, the Hargrove Estates event director, for the initial site consultation on the landscape redesign. She had been on duty the night of my wedding, and we both knew it, and neither of us raised it for the first hour of the meeting, during which we walked the property and I took measurements and asked questions, and she answered them with the practical directness of someone who has managed an event venue for 11 years and has seen most things. We were standing near the main entrance looking at the overgrown boxwood hedges that were coming out in phase 1, when she said, quietly and without particular ceremony, "I'm glad you're okay. I've thought about that night more than most." I thanked her and meant it. She nodded and pointed at the section of the path that needed regrading, and we moved on, which was the correct way to move on, with acknowledgement and then with work, with the honest recognition of what had happened, and then with the building of what came next. I spent the rest of the afternoon on the Hargrove grounds, measuring and noting and planning, while watching the October light change across the property and thinking about what I was going to put in the place of what was being removed. New plantings, new paths, new gradients. A landscape designed from accurate site conditions rather than from what looked good in a rendering before anyone had properly looked at the ground. The kind of design that takes longer to make and lasts longer when it's made, because it is rooted in what is actually there. I drove home with the site measurements and the photographs and the beginnings of a plan, and I sat at my drawing table that evening and began to sketch, and the heart in my chest, repaired, honest mind, beat steadily through every line.